It's funny how your whole world can collapse in an instant. One moment, you're a successful executive returning home early to surprise your wife, and the next, you're standing frozen in your own driveway, staring at an unfamiliar car parked where yours should be. I remember checking my watch, 9:47 p.m. Sarah wasn't expecting me until tomorrow evening. The Singapore deal had wrapped up ahead of schedule, and I'd managed to catch an earlier flight, imagining her delighted face when I walked through the door. 12 years of marriage, and I still loved surprising her. The house was mostly dark, except for our bedroom window casting a warm glow into the night. As I approached the front door, wheeling my carry-on behind me, I noticed little details that seemed off. 2 wine glasses on the patio table. A man's jacket draped over one of our deck chairs. My analytical mind started calculating probabilities, even as my heart rate accelerated. I unlocked the door as quietly as possible, years of business instincts kicking in. Gather data. Assess the situation. Don't react emotionally. The sound of music drifted down from upstairs, our wedding song, of all things. The irony wasn't lost on me. Then I heard it, laughter. Her laughter. But different somehow. Lighter, more carefree than I'd heard in years. Following the sound, I climbed the stairs, each step feeling like lead. My training told me to stay calm, to think clearly, but my hands were shaking. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, I could see Sarah's bare shoulders, her head thrown back in pleasure. And behind her, a man I recognized instantly, David Cooper, her high school sweetheart who'd recently moved back to town. The same David she'd assured me was just an old friend. I stood there, frozen, watching my wife betray every vow we'd ever made. The rational part of my brain documented details, the scattered clothes on the floor, the half-empty wine bottle on the nightstand, the way she moaned his name. Evidence. Data points. Facts to counter the denial already trying to creep in. But it was the small details that truly broke me. The fact that she was wearing the lingerie I'd bought her for our anniversary. The framed photo of our wedding day visible in the mirror's reflection. The casual intimacy that spoke of a long-standing affair, not a one-time mistake. I could have burst in, created a scene, let rage take over. Instead, I quietly took out my phone and recorded a brief video, just enough to ensure there could be no gaslighting later. Then I turned and walked away, my footsteps silent on the carpeted stairs. Back in my car, I sat gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The executive who closed million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat was gone. In his place sat a hollow man, systematically reviewing every business trip, every late night at the office, every girl's night out of the past year. The signs had been there. I'd just been too busy building our perfect life to notice them. Or maybe I'd chosen not to notice. Either way, sitting in that dark car, I made a decision. This wouldn't be a messy, emotional confrontation. No, this required a more calculated approach. I started the engine and drove to a nearby hotel, my mind already formulating a plan. Sarah thought she was playing a clever game? Fine. But she'd forgotten one crucial detail. In the corporate world, I specialized in hostile takeovers. And I was about to orchestrate the most hostile takeover of her life. The hotel room became my war room that night. As an executive who'd orchestrated dozens of corporate takeovers, I knew the first rule of warfare: never strike without proper intelligence. So I sat there, methodically constructing a timeline of Sarah's betrayal on my laptop, cross-referencing her work events with David's social media activity. The patterns emerged like constellations forming in chaos. Their affair hadn't been as clever as they thought. David's Instagram showed him coincidentally at the same restaurants where Sarah had her client dinners. His check-ins matched her late nights at the office. They'd even attended the same charity gala, though in Sarah's photos, he was carefully cropped out. I pulled up our joint bank statements, scanning them with new eyes. Small unexplained expenses bloomed like red flags. A lingerie store on a Tuesday afternoon. Hotel charges disguised as business lunches. The narrative of betrayal wrote itself in our financial history. Keep your emotions in check, I muttered, falling back on my corporate training. Focus on the data. But my hands trembled as I discovered a credit card I didn't know about, hidden statements revealing their secret life together. Weekend getaways. Expensive gifts. A life parallel to ours, funded by the success I'd worked so hard to achieve. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. Sarah, probably discovering I wasn't coming home tonight. Hey honey, everything okay? Your secretary said you'd be back tomorrow. The casual concern in her voice made my stomach turn. I thought of her, probably still in our bed, sheets changed, evidence erased, texting me as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just been with him. Flight delayed, I replied, the lie feeling bitter on my tongue. Probably won't make it back until late tomorrow. Don't wait up. Oh no. Well, get some rest. Love you. Love you. The words mocked me. I turned off my phone and returned to my investigation. By sunrise, I had a complete dossier of their affair. But more importantly, I had leverage. In reviewing our finances, I'd discovered Sarah's hidden vulnerabilities. The startup she'd been secretly investing in with David funded with money she'd siphoned from our joint accounts. The lease on a love nest, signed under her maiden name but paid for with transfers from our savings. All technically illegal. All documented. All perfect ammunition. I called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. Then I contacted my lawyer, Marcus, an old friend who specialized in high-stakes divorces. Jesus Christ, he muttered, reviewing the evidence I'd compiled. You've done my job for me. When did you find out? Last night. He looked up sharply. And you've already gathered all this? Most clients can barely string 2 sentences together the first week. I smiled grimly. In my line of work, Marcus, emotion is a luxury we can't afford. I need to know my options. For the next hour, we outlined a strategy that would make my corporate takeovers look merciful. Everything had to be perfectly timed. Bank accounts. Property deeds. Evidence of financial misconduct. One wrong move would alert Sarah, give her time to cover her tracks. You realize, Marcus said carefully, that with this level of documentation, you could probably have her charged with fraud. The DA would love this case. I considered it. The thought of Sarah in handcuffs held a certain appeal. But no, that would be too quick, too clean. I wanted her to experience the same slow-burning devastation she'd inflicted on me. No charges, I decided. I want her to lose everything the same way I did, piece by piece, watching it crumble, powerless to stop it. Marcus nodded, understanding. When do you want to move? I checked my watch. Sarah would be at work now, probably with him. Give me 48 hours to get everything in place. Then we start. As I left his office, my phone buzzed again. Another text from Sarah, miss you. Can't wait for you to come home. I stared at the message, remembering how she'd moaned his name last night. The last piece of my plan clicked into place. Oh, I'd come home all right. And the show I'd put on would be worthy of a Hollywood script. Let them enjoy their little romance for 2 more days. Soon they'd learn why my competitors called me the Iceman. Some things are best served cold. The next 48 hours passed like a well-orchestrated symphony of deception. I maintained our normal routine, texting Sarah throughout the day, playing the role of the unsuspecting husband stuck in Singapore. Each message she sent felt like a fresh wound, but I channeled that pain into refining my strategy. I chose Friday evening for the confrontation. Sarah had told me she was working late, but her hidden credit card had already revealed the truth: a reservation at Le Petit Jardin, the same restaurant where we'd had our first date. The poetry of it was almost admirable. At precisely 7:15 p.m., I walked into the dimly lit restaurant. They were at our old table, of course they were. Sarah's back was to me, but I could see David's face clearly. He was leaning in, their fingers intertwined on the white tablecloth, looking at my wife the way I used to. The diamond tennis bracelet I'd given her for our 10th anniversary glinted on her wrist as she gestured, telling him some story. I approached silently, years of boardroom negotiations having taught me the power of timing. A waiter saw me and started forward, but I held up a hand, maintaining my trajectory. 3 steps away, I heard Sarah's laugh, that same carefree sound from the other night. The wine list here has improved since we first came, hasn't it, Sarah? The transformation on their faces was almost beautiful in its completeness. Sarah's laugh died mid-sound, her body going rigid. David's expression shifted from confusion to recognition to fear in the span of seconds. But it was Sarah's eyes that I focused on, the way they widened, then narrowed, then filled with a calculation I'd never seen before. "James," she breathed, recovering quickly. You're home early." "Evidently." I pulled up a chair from a nearby table, sitting down casually. "Don't let me interrupt. You were saying something about the wine?" David started to stand. "I should dash." "Sit down, David." My voice was quiet but carried the same tone I used to crush hostile shareholders. "You're part of this conversation." He sat. "James, I can explain," Sarah began, her hand withdrawing from David's like she'd been burned. "Can you?" I removed my phone, placing it on the table. "Explain the hotel charges? The secret credit card? The money you've been funneling to David's startup?" With each question, I saw the color drain from her face. "Or perhaps you'd like to explain last Tuesday night, when I came home early from Singapore?" The silence that followed was exquisite. I watched the realization dawn in her eyes, not just that she'd been caught, but that she'd been outmaneuvered before the game even began. "How long have you known?" she whispered. "Long enough to ensure this conversation happens on my terms, not yours." I turned to David. "By the way, how's the startup going? Must be difficult, now that your primary investor's funding source has been compromised." David's face went ashen. "What do you mean?" "Check your business account," I suggested. "I believe you'll find some irregularities that the SEC might be interested in." Anonymous tip, of course. Sarah's composure cracked. "You can't dash." "I already have." I stood up, straightening my tie. "The divorce papers will be delivered to your office on Monday. Don't bother coming home, the locks have been changed, and security has your picture. The movers will deliver your personal belongings to your mother's house." "James, please," Sarah reached for my hand. "We can talk about this. We can fix this." I looked at her hand, the wedding ring I'd placed there 12 years ago catching the candlelight. Slowly, deliberately, I removed her fingers from mine. "There's nothing to fix, Sarah. You made your choice. Now you get to live with it." I turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and David? The SEC investigation might take a while. I'd postpone any major purchases if I were you." As I walked away, I heard Sarah begin to cry. Not the calculated tears she'd used to manipulate me over the years, but real, ugly sobs of someone watching their world collapse. Part of me wanted to turn back, to comfort her out of sheer habit. Instead, I stepped into the cool evening air, took a deep breath, and smiled. Phase 1 was complete. Now for the real devastation to begin. The aftermath of nuclear devastation is never as clean as the explosion itself. In the weeks following that night at Le Petit Jardin, I watched the fallout spread through our social circles with clinical detachment, each ripple revealing something new about the relationships I thought I understood. Sarah's first countermove was predictable. She tried to control the narrative. Tearful calls to our friends, carefully edited versions of events that cast her as the victim of a controlling, workaholic husband. But she'd forgotten one crucial detail: I'd already sent copies of the evidence to key people in our circle. Not everything, just enough to make them question her story. "You're handling this differently than I expected," my sister Jennifer commented over coffee one morning. She'd always been my closest confidant, the one person who saw through my corporate facade. I considered her observation while watching the steam rise from my cup. "The interesting thing about betrayal," I replied carefully, is that it forces you to become the person you always should have been. Every illusion gets stripped away. The divorce proceedings moved with the same ruthless efficiency as my corporate takeovers. Sarah's attempts to fight back only exposed more of her deceptions. The judge was particularly interested in the financial improprieties she'd tried to hide. "You've lost everything," she sobbed during our final mediation meeting. "Our home, our friends, our life together, doesn't any of it matter to you?" I studied her across the conference table, noting how her designer outfit couldn't quite hide the strain of recent weeks. "I didn't lose anything, Sarah. I simply removed what was already false." Her relationship with David imploded spectacularly once the SEC investigation gained traction. Turns out, my anonymous tip had uncovered more than just their misappropriated funding. David's entire business model was built on fraudulent data. He turned on Sarah quickly, trying to pin everything on her in exchange for leniency. But the most profound changes were happening internally. Each day, I found myself rediscovering parts of myself that had been suppressed during our marriage. I started playing jazz piano again, something Sarah had always subtly discouraged. I reconnected with old friends she deemed unsuitable. I began living authentically rather than performatively. 6 months after the confrontation, I was sitting in my new apartment, reviewing some acquisition proposals, when my phone buzzed. A text from Sarah: "I miss you. I miss us. Can we talk?" I stared at the message, surprised to feel nothing but a calm clarity. The man who would have ached at those words was gone, transformed through fire into someone stronger, more real. "There's no us," I typed back. There never really was. Then I turned back to my work, letting the evening sun warm my face through the floor-to-ceiling windows. In the background, Miles Davis played softly "Kind of Blue," my favorite album that Sarah had always hated. Later that night, Jennifer called with the latest social update. Sarah had been seen leaving a bar with some young entrepreneur, clearly drunk, clearly desperate to reclaim her former glory. David was facing federal charges. Their perfect little world had crumbled completely. "Are you happy?" Jennifer asked hesitantly. "About how everything turned out?" I considered the question carefully, analyzing my emotional state with the same precision I'd once used to dissect their affair. "Happiness isn't the right word," I finally replied. "I'm authentic. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I'm living without pretense." "And Sarah?" "Sarah's living with the consequences of her choices," I said simply. "Just as I'm living with the consequences of finally making better ones." We talked a while longer, but my mind was already drifting to tomorrow's challenges. A new company to acquire. A weekend trip to the coast. A life built on my terms, not constructed around someone else's expectations. As I got ready for bed that night, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The man looking back at me was older, perhaps harder, but also more genuine. The corporate mask had become unnecessary. I could be both the ruthless executive and the jazz-loving introvert. Both the strategic thinker and the emotional being. Sarah's betrayal had broken something in me, yes. But from those broken pieces, I'd built something far more valuable, a life of truth, of authenticity, of quiet strength. And that, I realized, was the greatest revenge of all. Exactly 1 year after the restaurant confrontation, I found myself analyzing quarterly reports in my office when my assistant buzzed through. "Mr. Mitchell, your ex-wife is here. She doesn't have an appointment." I checked my Patek Philippe, 2:15 p.m. The timing wasn't coincidental. Sarah had always possessed a flair for dramatic symbolism. 1 year to the hour since I'd dismantled her carefully constructed fantasy. "Give me 2 minutes," I responded, using the time to center myself. The executive suite provided a perfect vantage point of the city, 40 floors up. I'd chosen this office specifically for its psychological advantages. The height created a natural power dynamic for difficult negotiations. When Sarah entered, I noted the subtle changes a year had wrought. The designer clothes remained, but they hung differently on her frame. Her makeup, while impeccable, couldn't quite hide the strain around her eyes. The confident stride had become more measured, cautious. "James," she said softly, standing just inside the doorway. "You look well." I gestured to one of the leather chairs facing my desk. "What can I do for you, Sarah?" She sat, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. I observed this detail clinically, cataloging it alongside other data points. The nervous gesture. The way she'd positioned herself slightly forward, engaging. The folder she carried legal documents, perhaps. "I've been in therapy," she began. "Doing a lot of work on myself. Understanding why she paused, recalibrating. Why I destroyed something precious." I maintained my position behind the desk, hands folded, face neutral. "I appreciate you sharing that. However, I assume you didn't come here for a therapy debrief." "No." She opened the folder, withdrawing a stack of papers. "I want to show you something. Bank statements. Proof that I've paid back every penny I took. Character references. Proof that I've changed." The methodical part of my brain noted the organization of her documents, chronological, tabbed, highlighted. Sarah had always excelled at presentations. But there was a desperation in her preparation that hadn't existed before. "I'm not looking for reconciliation," she continued quickly. "I know that's impossible. But I thought, maybe we could try being friends. Start small? Coffee once a month?" I studied her for a long moment, processing the complex algorithms of emotion and logic this proposal triggered. "Why now, Sarah?" She looked down at her hands, then back up. "Because I finally understand what I lost. Not just the lifestyle or the social status, though God knows that's gone too. But the real thing. The partnership we had. The trust." "The trust," I repeated softly. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. "I know it can never be the same," she pressed on. "But you were my best friend for 12 years. Couldn't we salvage something from the wreckage?" The analytical part of my mind dissected her proposal, examining it from all angles. The emotional part registered a dull ache, not of longing, but of recognition. She was experiencing now what I'd felt that night a year ago, the desperate need to preserve something already irretrievably lost. "Sarah," I said carefully, "friendship requires trust. Trust requires truth. And the truth is, we never really knew each other at all. The woman I trusted never existed. The man you married wasn't real either, he was a construct, designed to fit your expectations." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Progress, perhaps. That's not true. We had real moments. Did we?" I leaned back slightly. "Or did we have carefully curated performances of what we thought marriage should look like?" Sarah sat in silence for several moments, absorbing my words. I found myself analyzing her response with the same detachment I'd used studying market trends, noting micro-expressions, cataloging subtle shifts in posture, processing data points that told a deeper story. "You've changed," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," I corrected gently. "I've emerged. There's a difference." I stood and walked to the window, using the physical movement to organize my thoughts. Below, the city continued its eternal dance of commerce and ambition. How fitting that this conversation should happen here, in this tower of glass and steel where I'd built my professional identity. Do you know what I realized during this past year? I turned back to face her. Our marriage wasn't destroyed by your affair. The affair was merely a symptom of something that was never whole to begin with. She flinched slightly. "What do you mean?" "We were both playing roles, Sarah. I was the successful executive husband, you were the perfect corporate wife. We performed these parts so convincingly that we fooled even ourselves. The affair didn't break us, it simply shattered the illusion." I returned to my desk, noting how my calm analysis seemed to unsettle her more than any display of anger could have. "Your desire for friendship now, it's not about reconnecting. It's about preserving the last remnant of that performance." "That's not true," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I opened my laptop, pulling up a document I'd prepared months ago for just such a conversation. Your social media activity shows a 72% decline in engagement since our divorce. Your attempt to join the country club board was rejected last month. The startup community that once embraced you has quietly distanced itself. Her face paled. You've been monitoring me? I've been studying patterns, I corrected. It's what I do. And the pattern here suggests you're not seeking friendship, you're seeking rehabilitation. Social proof that you're not the villain in this story. Tears finally spilled over, tracking mascara down her cheeks. Is that so wrong? To want to fix what I broke? For the first time in our conversation, I allowed myself to feel something close to compassion. Not for who she was, but for who she might have been if we'd both chosen authenticity over performance earlier. Sarah, I said softly, some things, once broken, serve us better by remaining broken. They free us to build something real in their place. I stood, signaling the end of our meeting. I wish you well. I truly do. But whatever you're looking for, redemption, closure, friendship, you won't find it here. It's time for both of us to stop performing and start living. She gathered her documents with trembling hands, smearing tears across the carefully prepared evidence of her reformation. At the door, she paused. Are you happy, James? I considered the question carefully, applying the same analytical rigor I'd use evaluating a complex merger. I'm authentic, I replied. And I've discovered that's worth far more than happiness based on illusion. After she left, I remained at my desk, processing the interaction. My phone buzzed, a text from Jennifer, still on for jazz tonight? I smiled, feeling the genuine warmth of real connection. Wouldn't miss it, I replied. That evening, as I listened to the raw, honest notes of live jazz fill the club, I reflected on the strange geometry of life. How losing everything I thought I wanted had led me to discover everything I actually needed. How betrayal had become the catalyst for authenticity. How the end of one performance had allowed the beginning of a genuine life. Sarah's visit had been the final scene in a play I'd stopped performing. Now, surrounded by the truth of music and real friendship, I was free to write my own story, not as a character in someone else's drama, but as myself, unbound by expectations, unleashed by the very betrayal that had once threatened to destroy me.